Hi, it's Ferris here from Gardening with Spirit, and today I wanted to share some of my tips on choosing when to start sowing in the year. I have been gardening and sowing plants and vegetables, flowers, herbs for probably about 7 years now, and there are some universal tips that us growers follow. Now, interestingly, I do what I call co-creative intuitive gardening, where I really connect with my land and I ask it when things want to be planted. And most gardeners will do that to some form, because when you plant depends on your climate, depends on your microclimate. So gardeners check things like frost dates. When is the last date it's frosty? I'm here in Ireland. I'm in, I think it's zone 8B, I think, for that US hardiness, universal hardiness rating. And we get the last frosts about the second week in May. Now, sometimes it can be even later than that. Also, it depends on soil temperature and what you're growing. Things like broad beans, they can survive in quite cold temperatures. Some people overwinter them, whereas something like tomatoes or courgettes, they're going to require a much warmer soil temperature to go into. So that is something to consider. I will link, for those growing flowers, to an article from Higgledygarden, where he gives the wonderful advice for if you're sowing for your flower seeds directly: is the soil warm enough that you would sit on it with a bare bottom? I prefer to think of it like the elbow in the baby's bath water. Is that soil warm enough that you'd be comfortable on it? I think, doesn't that conjure up lovely images? But they're the sort of things to consider, and check in with your neighbours. What do they grow? When do they plant? And if you've experienced, look back on your own experience. Like with tomatoes, when I first grew tomatoes, and I have this indoor heater propagator, I would start them off in like January. But then they get really leggy on the windowsill, and I wouldn't really want to put them out into the little sort of glass house, and that didn't work well for me. So then I started doing them later. I find things catch up. That happens with a lot of sowings in March, might catch up in April. And if you look at the seed packets, a lot of seed packets could say grow in spring. Well, this is marjoram, grow all year round. Oops. Sow March to April. And then some others, you know, they'll have sowing times when you can sow them. But obviously they're selling to people all across the country. You know, somebody's microclimate, say in Cornwall or in Cork, is going to be different than somebody in Scotland or in Belfast. So it's wise to look back what happens locally, other gardeners in your area, and see. Now, I do go one step further because I do co-creative gardening. I directly ask my seeds and my garden when they would like to be planted. That may seem a bit far-fetched to some, but my reckoning is that nature has a lot of intelligence, and nature can tell me even more than looking, you know, what general patterns there are. Now, last year and the year before, I followed a way to do this from Michelle Smallwright in the Perelandra gardens in the States, and here's what I did. Now, I actually did kinesiology with the different seeds, and I had a chart. So I would go through the seeds and I would write down when they would like to be planted. And that's how I did it last year. In some ways, that's really methodical. You can sit down in January and February and you can know it all. And if you don't want to do gut gardening, intuitive gardening, co-creative gardening, you could just sit down and plan it out. What seems a reasonable time to plant carrots? What seems a reasonable time to plant courgettes? Things like courgettes usually start off even April, May, because they're really tender. Things like that. This year I'm doing it slightly differently, because with that plan, as methodical as it was, it slightly overwhelmed me. And when I planned in advance, if I was then ill or away, I'd have to reschedule things. It also did not help me with successional sowing. Things like spinach I would sow repeatedly, things like radish I would sow repeatedly. So this year, my co-creative approach is slightly different, as in I am checking in on the day when I have time to plant what's going to be good to sow that day. So it does mean a bit more checking, but it's where I use my intuition. Like earlier in the week, the tomatoes and the chilies were just saying, please, 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 sow me now, sow me now. So I knew that was when I was going to sow them. Other things I would check. I have a feeling that things like the echinacea and rudbeckia were going to be planted soon, and other things. So that's how I do it. I actually do mussel testing. I'll send you a link to the Perelandra site if you're at all interested in that. But that's sharing my approach, because I know some people have been curious with me doing this co-creative gardening and this gut gardening. Gut gardening is where you kind of go with your instincts, not necessarily having to do this testing. And I bet there are many, many, many gardeners out there who don't have to consciously do that gut gardening. They just know, they just get the feel of their land, they just get the feel of the soil, and they just get the feel of the timing for the year. So if that's you, and don't underestimate the power of that. Not everybody has to do that consciously. It's just an experiment I like to play with, and it's the experiment that I'm sharing here with you guys. And already it's been quite interesting. The tomatoes and the chilies went in. I have some tagetes gone in, and they're already coming up only about 3 days later. Really exciting. So a lot of the things that I've kinesiologied or intuited to plant now make a lot of sense. Now this is an experiment, and some things may be a bit strange, and one of them already has been, because I got courgette wanted to be sown. Now it's way too early to sow courgettes in my mind. I would usually do that in April. But in the spirit of experience, I'm going to try it anyway and see what happens, because when you're developing this style of gut gardening, sometimes you have to go with it and see what works. It's not life or death if it doesn't work out. It's all part of the learning process, and I really like to learn and play, so that is what I'm doing. So that's it for now. Bye bye. Thought I'd finish off by giving you a really quick sneaky peek into that heated propagator. Just taking the top off there, and I have my tomatoes and those little tagetes coming up. I always like to see those first signs, and I'm curious, I'd like to know, how do you choose when to sow your seeds? Is it down to experience? Do you ask other people locally? Do you follow some of the sayings, like that you start planting your potatoes on St. Patrick's Day, or that you sow your sweet peas on Boxing Day? What is it that you use to decide when you plant your seeds? I would love to hear your comments below this video. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.